Hi everyone, my name is Brenna Johnston and I will be summarizing Chapter 13 of Coercion and Its Fallout by Murray Sidman. And this chapter is titled Between a Rock and a Hard Place. And this chapter is titled in such a way because within it, Sidman explains how we often take coercion for granted and find ourselves either on the receiving end or as the ones wielding the stick, as he says, when it comes to punishment. With the enforcement of punishment contingencies, however, punishment is rarely all that is present, as escape and avoidance are often produced as a result. In addition to the production of escape and avoidance, another way we get more than what we want when we utilize punishment is that we tend to overuse this form of punishment when we see that it was successful at the start. Sidman provides us with the example of the therapist who successfully cured a self-destructive child who would tear at his own eyes and skin, and the therapist cured him by using a cattle prod to shock him. Following this success, the therapist used the cattle prod for all behavior problems. And we see similar continuity of punishment and punishing behaviors by people in charge, such as prison guards who become monsters and rulers who become tyrants due to the successes they had in punishing and the joy they gained from doing so. And the next section covers conditioned suppression, which is addressed through another basic experiment involving a laboratory rat. Prior to the experiment, we were asked a popular question: what happens when such intense shocks threaten and we are unable to make them go away, when we have no place to hide or to run for safety? And within the experiment, a laboratory rat learns to get his food by pressing the lever, similar to experiments we read about in chapters prior. However, rather than receiving his food every time he pressed the lever, the food came unpredictably, whether that be within 2 seconds or 5 minutes of pressing the lever. By developing this type of work schedule, the rat works steadily, which is imperative in the study since we're looking for variations in its normal rate of work once shock is introduced into the experiment. While the subject is steadily pressing the lever and working for his food, a tone is introduced lasting 1 minute, followed by a brief shock that lasts 1/10 of a second. The shock is unavoidable, but the rat can still continue pressing the lever during the 1 minute tone. The experiment is similar to a person who is steadily working at their own job when their boss comes in and tells them to come meet with them in 5 minutes to discuss their poor performance. The person could continue working steadily, but the shock will still come at the end of those 5 minutes. One might expect the rat to continue pressing the lever during the tone in an attempt to get food, and since there was nothing the rat could do about the impending shock, but once the tone would come on, the rat would change its behavior drastically. It would be trembling, crouching, urinating, and defecating. The behavior is compared to what is often termed paralyzing anxiety. When we compare that to the person at his job who is not likely to continue working productively, at least, with the shock that awaits him. The subject was able to work steadily whenever the tone was not on, but once on, he would return to his severe behavioral depression, as Sidman called it, and then termed it conditioned suppression. We tend to use the term anxiety when referring to this feeling that something bad will happen and there's no way of escape, and you're probably wondering why he's talking about anxiety, because we often hear that it's a form of mentalism, but Sidman notes that we can call such a reaction anxiety as long as we don't believe it to be the cause of anything. Sidman delves deeper into this reaction of anxiety, even depression, when he discusses the severely aversive events that are unavoidable in people's lives, such as developing a fatal illness or a loved one dying. Such inescapable threats cause us to lose the ability to function properly. Condition suppression is seen in varying degrees of intensity, and Sidman provides us with some examples. One example being in warfare, in which soldiers are threatened with dismemberment, being captured, losing their comrades, or losing their own lives, ultimately affecting how they function day to day. Another example is when a mother tells their child, "Just you wait until your father gets home," affecting the child's behavior for the remainder of the day as they await their punishment from their father. Acts of coercion and coercive practices that cannot be escaped even cause people as well as objects to become condition suppressors. A policeman or the police uniform itself has become a signal for impending shock, and a person may react with blind panic as they cannot escape an approaching police officer, and the policeman would have no choice but to respond with suspicion or self-defense. There are times in which condition suppression can be used to one's advantage. In nature, when animals fight to the death, whether over territory or over a mate, the animal losing will often cower and adopt a submissive posture to show they're ready for that final blow or that final slash. This is used to the underdog's advantage because this posture usually turns off the attacker, leaving the underdog more likely to avoid the ultimate disaster, which is death. This can be compared to humans who raise a white flag to surrender or say mercy to their attacker. In the military, soldiers would often develop combat fatigue, a condition suppression that used to result in being pulled from the front lines and placed in a base hospital for treatment, which would then allow them to escape from the impending dangers of combat. And the chapter concludes with a discussion in regard to the implementation of additional studies involving rats, with the goal of finding out how more and less frequent shocks affect the rat's productivity. In the earlier experiment, we found that the tone or warning signal for unavoidable shock would throw the rat into counterproductive anxiety. Losing all its food it could have earned when the signal was on. It then returned to productive labor once the tone and shock had ended. And they wanted to know, how would more frequent warning signals and shocks affect its productivity, and how would rarely occurring warning signals and shocks affect this? And also, how would these new conditions affect the rat's anxiety? Results of the experiments actually showed that more frequent signals and shocks produce less anxiety, and less frequent signals and shocks produce more anxiety. This is actually because the rat lost little food when the signals and shocks occurred less frequently, showing that the rat could afford to lose the food because it happened so infrequently. When this occurred frequently, however, the rat could not afford to not work through it because it lost a significant portion of its food by not pressing the lever. The rat adapted by continuing to be productive and not succumb to its anxiety. When compared to humans, those who can afford to miss days at work when experiencing the occasional anxiety attack do so, while those who cannot afford to miss a day of work because they have bills to pay and families to feed will continue working through their crippling anxiety. And that concludes my summary of the chapter. My questions for you guys are: one, can you think of a specific time in your life when you experience condition suppression? Why were you unable to avoid or escape what was to come? And 2, do you think we can treat condition suppression? If so, how could it be treated, whether it's psychiatric, pharmacologic, etc.? Thank you guys so much for watching. I look forward to hearing your responses.